Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 38, Too Many Sons. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Louis smoothly succeeded his father as ruler of the Frankish Empire. However, he wanted his own advisors, so his father's advisors were exiled. After the Pope traveled north to crown Louis emperor, Louis held an assembly to settle the succession. Lothar, the eldest son, became co-emperor, while his other sons Pippin and Louis received Aquitaine and Bavaria respectively. Great, except Bernard, Louis's nephew and king of Italy, was not mentioned. Naturally, Bernard traveled north to talk to his uncle, but was declared a rebel and blinded, while his followers were executed. Even Louis's half-brothers were placed in remote monasteries. The empire did not face a genuine external threat, but Louis had failed to expand the empire's borders because the powerful nobles who actually ran the large empire were unenthusiastic. Admittedly, there was no major revolt, but Louis clearly needed to improve relations with the nobles. It is doubtful that Louis genuinely felt any guilt, but he needed to do something to improve his reputation, and the wedding of Lothar to Ermengarde, daughter of Count Hugh of Tours in 821, was an opportunity, since the ceremony was attended by the nobles of the empire. Adelard, Wala, and other nobles accused of conspiring with Bernard were restored to the court and received back their lands. Adelard became abbot of Corbie again, while Wala became an advisor at court. Louis's half-brothers were released from their respective monasteries. Drogo soon became bishop of Metz, and Hughes became abbot of St. Quentin. What could explain this change in attitude? Well, Louis's wife Ermengarde had died in 817, and he remarried 2 years later, selecting Judith, the daughter of Count Welf, an influential landowner in Bavaria and Alemannia. A new wife may have had an influence on his temper, but the key factor seems to have been the death of his main advisor Benedict in February 821. Given the timing, there was clearly a shift in the power structure in Louis's court. Actually, Benedict may have played a role in the exile of Wala and Adelard, since Adelard had been abbot of Corbie and had clashed with Benedict over monastic reform. While there was undoubtedly a degree of politics behind the decision, Louis appears to have genuinely regretted his harsh treatment of his relatives. Moreover, Louis likely felt more secure as emperor in 821 since he had been ruling for 7 years. Still, it seems that the decision to end the exile of Louis's relatives had failed to fully improve relations with the nobles. Therefore, the assembly in 822 produced a more drastic attempt. Determined to atone for Bernard's death, Louis made a public confession and then performed penance. Once Louis had completed his penance, he oversaw the wedding of his second son Pippin to Ringar, daughter of Count Theodebert from Normandy. Clearly, this improved treatment of the nobles had an effect, since the Frankish army crushed the revolt in Croatia in 822 and Leodewitt fled into exile. While Leodewitt had never been a genuine threat to the Frankish Empire, the Croatian prince had defeated 2 separate Frankish armies, and the Margrave of Friuli had even died during one of the battles. The third Frankish army was much larger than the first 2, which indicates that Louis had only been able to convince his nobles to march east after he had changed his behavior. Anyway, the borders were once again secure. Honestly, given the massive size of the empire, Louis's main challenge was domestic stability. As long as he did not have any more sons, the succession had a good chance of being orderly, which would have been true if he had not married a much younger woman. Beautiful, smart, and ambitious, Judith worked to increase her family's position, so her mother and her brothers received abbeys. Oddly enough, her brother Conrad became abbot of St. Gall and then married Adelaide, sister of Ermengarde, wife of co-emperor Lothar. These marriage alliances on their own were undoubtedly resented by other relatives and favorites who had been displaced, but were not dangerous. Louis and Judith had a daughter in 820, but the situation remained stable until Judith gave birth to a son on June 13th, 823. Again, royal names have a deep meaning. So Lothar was probably worried when he learned that Louis had named his newborn son Charles. Still, Lothar and his brothers Pippin and Louis were undoubtedly aware of their family's history and knew that the odds were against all three of them being alive when the emperor died, never mind a young baby in an age of widespread infant mortality. Other matters were taking place on the northern border. Recognizing that he could not retake the Danish throne on his own, Harald Klak sought backing from Louis, and this pressure convinced Godfred's sons to share the throne in 819. Unsurprisingly, this agreement did not last long, and the brothers evicted Harald in 823. Once again, he asked Louis for help, and this time Louis suggested that he convert. Honestly, he had probably made the suggestion before, but this time Harald was desperate enough to agree. Remember, the Danes had watched the Franks extend their borders north into neighboring Frisia and then Saxony, using the claim that they were merely spreading the Christian faith. Since the Franks routinely employed violence to protect missionaries, the Danes understood that a Christian rival was a real threat. As a result, the brothers sent their own envoys to Louis in 825 to arrange peace. The next year, Danish envoys attended the imperial assembly to ratify the peace agreement, but they found themselves witnessing the baptism of Harald Klak and his key followers. In return, he received a county on the coast of Frisia, basically a safe haven for his raids into Denmark. This arrangement was a smart investment by Louis. If Harald Klak gained the throne with the help of Louis, the Danish kingdom would become a protectorate of the Frankish Empire. At the same time, Frisia was vulnerable to Viking raids, so Harald was likely expected to defend the region. While the brothers were undoubtedly concerned, Harald never seemed to have attracted enough followers to make another serious attempt for the Danish throne. So, what was the situation with Louis' sons? Although he had been named King of Bavaria in 817, Louis only arrived there in 826 when he was about 20 years old. Bavaria had been a Roman frontier province, so it contained Roman roads and villas. Bavaria also had a history of autonomy since it had been ruled during the 7th and 8th centuries by the Agilolfings, a Frankish dynasty of independent dukes. Their autonomy had ended in 788 when Charles had accused Duke Tassilo of insufficient fealty and threw him and his son into a monastery, thus eliminating a dangerous rival. Bavaria had become accustomed to Frankish rule by the time Louis arrived. In fact, Louis embraced his position as King of Bavaria by making the old Roman city Regensburg his main residence. Still, Louis faced a major threat, the Bulgars. While Omurtag had followed the peace treaty with the Eastern Empire, the Khanate continued to expand westwards, moving closer to the Frankish Empire. Hoping to avoid another destructive war, in 824, Omurtag sent envoys to Emperor Louis, proposing a peace treaty to settle their borders. When the emperor refused to discuss the matter, Omurtag decided to encourage him to reconsider and sent a fleet raiding along the Drava River in 827. Actually, this was not a punitive raid, but an invasion, since the Slavic dukes who ruled as Frankish clients were replaced by Bulgar governors. Obviously, someone had to bear the blame. No, not Emperor Louis. He was an emperor, and emperors don't have to bear the blame for their mistakes. It is one of the perks of the position. Instead, the blame fell on the Frankish dukes who held the southeastern frontiers. Balderic was Duke of Friuli, part of the Kingdom of Italy, and Gerald was prefect of the Bavarian Eastland, part of Bavaria. When the Frankish court assembled at Aachen in February 828, Emperor Louis removed Balderic from his office and divided Friuli into 4 counties: Carantania, Carniola, Istria, and a much smaller Friuli. Honestly, this punishment seems unfair. While Balderic had been responsible for the region, the emperor's refusal to negotiate was a key factor behind the raids. Most important, King Louis and Gerald benefited from the division, especially Louis, since the new province of Carantania became part of Bavaria, and the local Slavic rulers were replaced by Frankish Bavarian counts loyal to King Louis. Basically, the territory of King Louis had been expanded at the expense of his brother Lothar, King of Italy and overlord of Friuli, which had become smaller, much smaller. King Louis soon justified the emperor's decision when he drove the Bulgars out of the disputed region later that year. The transfer of a single province from Lothar's control to King Louis does not prove a growing conflict between the two brothers, but Louis had moved the previous year to control the border between their domains. The Bremer Pass was the transportation link through the Alps between southern Bavaria and northern Italy, and Louis had placed a key fortress along the path in the hands of a bishop loyal to him, as if he was preparing against an invasion by his brother Lothar. Then, 2 months later, Emperor Louis arranged for part of Friuli to be taken from Lothar and given to King Louis. Since the division of Friuli had been authorized by Emperor Louis, it is worth asking if the emperor was using King Louis to counterbalance his increasingly powerful son King Lothar. The answer seems to be yes. But a better question would be, why would the emperor fear Lothar? Well, Lothar had made a marriage alliance with the powerful Count Hugh of Tours, and he had built a strong kingdom in Italy. Wait, why was Lothar in Italy? As co-emperor, he should have been in Frankia. Well, Lothar had taken his position of co-emperor seriously and had attempted to govern as a co-emperor. Maybe Louis did not enjoy reminders of his mortality, or maybe he did not want to actually share power with his son, so he had sent Lothar to Italy in 822, accompanied by recently released Wala, who had advised first Pippin and then Pippin's son Bernard. Setting up his court at Pavia, Lothar had responded to his exile by forging an alliance with Pope Paschal I and had himself crowned emperor on Easter 823. Paschal had succeeded Stephen IV in 817, but the succession had taken place 24 hours after Stephen's death, so it resembles a coup more than a succession. Paschal likely crowned Lothar to follow the work of his predecessor Stephen and keep the papacy involved in the crowning of emperors. Remember, Stephen had traveled all the way to Rheims in 816 to crown Louis emperor, and then the emperor had crowned Lothar co-emperor a year later, without any participation by the Pope. So when Lothar moved into the neighborhood, Pope Paschal saw an opportunity, and Lothar likely saw the advantage of a ceremony that did not involve his father. Actually, the alliance between Paschal and Lothar may not have been smooth, since Paschal had 2 senior officials of the papal administration executed in the summer because they were too loyal to the new emperor. Unsurprisingly, Lothar sent envoys to investigate the execution, but they encountered a wall of silence and then abandoned the investigation. Sadly, they were not the only victims of Paschal's tough love, so when he died in February 824, the new pope, Eugenius II, promptly swore an oath of loyalty to the emperor, presumably the closer one, not the one in Aachen. Lothar then traveled to Rome to improve the lives of the people of Rome, and he arranged for political exiles, including the families of Paschal's victims, to be allowed to return to Rome. Having ensured a cooperative papacy, Lothar could focus on his own career prospects. Avoiding direct opposition to his father, Lothar built an alliance with nobles like Count Manfred of Orléans and his father-in-law Count Hugh of Tours, Charles's cousin Wala, and Bishop Jonat of Orléans, who all shared a desire to preserve the unity of the existing empire and their own positions within that empire. Like Wala, Hugh had been a key advisor of Charles, serving as his envoy to Constantinople to negotiate the Treaty of Aachen. It is important to stress that there is no evidence that Lothar was actively preparing to revolt against his father, but he was clearly building a network of supporters. Remember, Lothar would become sole emperor when his father died, and he probably knew that his brothers would not meekly accept the situation, so he was apparently preparing for his father's death. Part of the problem with Louis's restless sons is that the powerful nobles of the Carolingian Empire were uncomfortable with the dominance of the Carolingian family. Possibly they felt that Louis did not consult them as much as his father or his grandfather had. Both Charles and Pippin had faced few revolts, but they were more ruthless leaders and they had ruled during a period of expansion, which provided loot and new lands for the nobles to keep them satisfied. This raises a good question. Why had Louis stopped expanding the empire's borders? Or, more accurately, why had Louis failed to expand the empire's borders? Yes, the slow, grinding conflict against the Emirate of Cordoba continued, but little territory was gained. As I said, Louis had backed Harald Klak's attempt to retake the throne of Denmark, but it had failed. King Louis was slowly pressing east, but very slowly. Charles had united his nobles in annual campaigns, but there is no mention of Emperor Louis leading a major campaign. So, what was happening in the Eastern Empire? Emperor Leo's rule appeared stable, but a close ally named Michael was accused of conspiring against him, so he was thrown into jail. The legend is very dramatic and probably exaggerated, but we know that Leo was assassinated on Christmas Day 820. Michael became emperor and appeared to face little opposition. However, Michael soon had to deal with a revolt by Thomas the Slav, a senior general. Actually, it would be more accurate to describe Thomas as a rival for the throne who intended to avenge Leo, rather than a rebel. Thomas proved popular since he was charming, championed the poor, and had not assassinated his predecessor in a church on Christmas Day, presuming that the legend of Leo's death is accurate. Based in Asia Minor, Thomas recruited a large army. The new emperor proved to have little support outside of Constantinople, so Thomas's army grew as he marched towards the capital. All he had to do was to force Constantinople to surrender. The first attempt in December 821 failed, as did a second attempt in the spring. While Thomas had a large army, Michael had very large walls and enough food to survive a siege. Still, the situation favored Thomas, so Michael asked Amurtag for help. Amurtag agreed to honor the Treaty of 815 and led an army against Thomas in March 823. Accounts differ on who won the battle, but Thomas abandoned the siege of Constantinople and was finally handed over by his own men. He was executed around the beginning of 824, but the war had ruined much of the stability created by Leo. Actually, Michael had more problems since Crete had been captured by Muslims who had fled Al-Andalus in 816 after a failed revolt against the Emir of Cordoba. Crete then became a base for raids in the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. 2 years later, Sicily was captured by a force of Arabs. Once they had Sicily, they expanded across the strait into southern Italy. So Michael had two problems with islands, but he focused his attention more on Crete, unsurprisingly since it was closer. Once again, the Franks were fortunate because their external rivals were too busy with their own problems to invade. Emperor Louis was struggling to retain control of the existing empire. Still, this growing tension between the emperor and his eldest son could probably be managed. To sum up, hoping to improve relations with the nobles, Louis admitted guilt for the death of his nephew and ended the exile of several of his relatives. However, he also remarried, and his new wife gave birth to a son, complicating the succession. Expansion of the empire appeared to have stopped, so Louis gave a county in Frisia to a Danish exile in exchange for stopping Viking raids. In the east, the empire was busy with a civil war, and the Bulgars limited themselves to raids on Bavaria. While the empire's borders were relatively stable, Louis's sons were clearly becoming restless, especially Lothar, the eldest, who was preparing for the inevitable struggle over the succession when the emperor died. It was a good question whether Louis could avoid conflict with his sons, and I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.